Hello, hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2020. This is a SIG release meeting. It's a meeting that is recorded and available on the internet. So please be mindful of what you say and do. Please be sure to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and in general, just be awesome folks. So today I wanted to talk about Kubernetes 119, right? We are joined here today by Taylor, who is our incoming Kubernetes 119 release team lead. So Taylor, Tim, and I have been chatting a little bit about some of the stuff that we're going to be working on for 119. And I figure that we'll do this. I'll just share, you know what? I'll share my to-do list. How about that? And we can go through it that way. All right, so can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome, cool. All right, so I've got some things here where the dates are not quite set. This is just kind of like level setting for me, level setting for Taylor and Tim. Taylor is also using Todoist, so I figured it'd be a good way for us to collaborate on a few things. So the first one up on my list, at least, was proposed delaying the 119 start. So we talked about that a little bit, and what that could look like. And I think we've decided that we're not going to do that, right, Taylor? Based on some of the targets that we're trying to hit for the cycle. If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's 100%. That was definitely in the gut of a lot of us. Is just, with everything that's going on, be nice to take a little bit more time, strengthen some of the things that we're trying to come into the 119 release with. And unfortunately, looks like that threw code freeze as well as a couple of other dates into jeopardy, kind of threw them closer to July 4th and summer holidays. And so, it's kind of like we'd have to hit those dates before all of that happens rather than after, if we wanted to guarantee, actually getting some of those things done and giving people some leeway. So we're looking at that. We still want to target all of the dates that we're going to set, but we want to, talk with a lot of the SIGs and make sure that they know, let's focus a little bit more on stability. Yes, features are fantastic, but let's try to make this a little bit more of a snow leopard release, and get in while we can, but not put anyone out in the rain in terms of trying to get things done before the deadlines. Take it easy.
For sure. Cool. So that said, we're planning. Did we decide that 13th is going to be our date?
Oh, correct.
Okay, cool. So the release.
It's not a Friday, so there's that.
It's a Monday. So yeah, talking. We decided on a few things. You want to talk about some of the membership of the release team now that we've settled a few things?
Well, I'd love to do that, Stephen. And later, I have put a link. I'll throw it here in the chat as well. So this is the pull request that is literally pulling in the 119 release leads. And then I believe we have one of the proposed shadows on the call as well, Bob. So spoken with him. I'm speaking with a couple more people about release lead shadow position. The release lead survey is going to go out a little bit later today is what we're aiming for, so we can start to pull more shadows in, but we do have the leads in place and that PR is open. So if y'all want to see who made the cut, that is where you can check it out.
And a lot of this information should not be surprising to anyone. These shadows were selected on the selection issue, or these leads, excuse me, were selected on the selection issue for 119 that kicked up in the 118 cycle. An additional add since then as Tim is going to be joining the team as the emeritus advisor. So we talked about following the 118 retrospective. It's something that I've been staring at for a few cycles, and I think that the community meeting or the retrospective, the two parts of the retrospective, are one really big opportunity that we have to basically showcase to the community what we've been working on for the quarter. And I really believe that we should do our best to make sure that the issues that we talk about during the retrospective actually get completed for the next cycle. So that said, I think that Taylor, myself, Tim agreed. Tim has an abundance of knowledge as a previous release team lead, as a sub-project owner for a lot of the sub-projects that we have, or well, all of the sub-projects that we have for SIG release, as well as one of the SIG release co-chairs. That Tim would be an excellent candidate to run through, kind of ensuring that we're running through that backlog of previous retrospective issues, as well as applying all of the appropriate context that he has from experiences in the release team lead role and the SIG chair role as one of the patch release team members. So I think that that's going to be super valuable for the team. I'm super excited to have that happen. And yeah, it should be. I think we've got a great crew of people. It's seen some really excellent work from all of these people across the last few cycles, leading up to them becoming leads for 119. So congrats to the team that is set in place right now, and I'll be watching you. No. Okay, so Taylor, I noticed some tiny. I have some tiny nits on this one. I'm just gonna say real quick before this merges. All right, cool. So the next one is the focus doc for this quarter. So I think that what we've noticed over the last few cycles, or in general, is that we're kind of reactive to things that happen during the cycle, and so as an issue pops up, someone will solve it. But I think that we could. It'd be pretty valuable for us to have just kind of a focus document for the quarter. Some of the things that are in my head and Tim's head and the rest of the sub-project owners about what we're looking to accomplish for the quarter. And so the reason I'm sharing my to-do list with you and kind of running through some of this stuff is because this is what's in my head right now, right? And some of these dates are just kind of like mental dates for myself to start looking at things, not so much for you. But I will put together a document that kind of talks about what we should be looking at. So some big things are like the KubeADM out of tree KEP. If you saw earlier today, Lubomir sent out an email talking about how we manage client components that could be out of tree that are currently in tree, right? And how we kind of guide them in that process from going from in tree to out of tree, right? So the things that are required there, branching and tagging strategies, release strategy, how we do packaging for those client components. Are things that we're really looking to discuss and drive down for this cycle. KubeADM is one of them. kubectl will likely be next. And then there are a slew of other components, within Kubernetes that we need to look at. So, this is interesting because it's one of those things that we have tied essentially, like, fundamentally rooted into the way we do releases, right? So it's in the release library or the make files within Kubernetes, and then maybe it's rooted in checks that are done in a Nago to publish to certain locations based on these client components. So there are a lot of things that we need to stare at, and we need to figure out how to start detangling that ball of wax. We talked about that a little bit in 118, and decided that the time that we were starting the conversation was maybe a little too late in the game to be successful for some of that stuff in 118. So we're going to put a sharper focus on that for 119. The next one is the working group LTS support policy. Right, so there's a KEP that's currently open, and I've mentioned these a few times. These are two open KEPs right now. The LTS support policy essentially discussion of bringing our support policy up from 9 months, or approximately 9 months, up to a year, right? So giving people more opportunity, operators more opportunity to upgrade their components in a way that is more maybe amenable to their schedules, while keeping them within the support cycle. So check that, check that KEP out when you get a chance. Yeah, any questions so far? Okay. And if anyone wants to copy links over for some of these things, Phil, it would be appreciated.
Got you.
Cool. So the next one is post-merge work for the enhancements KEP, right? So we had an enhancements KEP, and I'll show this to you real quick. So this is kind of like the aggregate of the multiple hats that I have on at times. What did we do? We did this, right? So Tim Hawken put up a PR to do some improvements to how we manage the KEP artifacts. So you'll see this start to pop up in our enhancements collection for 119. I believe it's an architecture and improve KEP implementation. Okay, so if you're familiar with the meta KEP, which was KEP 1A, right? It's kind of an offshoot of KEP 1, which defines what the KEP process is. The meta KEP has become 617, right? So what we're doing there is we're now binding KEPs to the issues that they are related to, right? So one of the ideas is that, so you can see 617, enhance the KEP implementation. This was opened a while back, and it's connected to a few things, and you can see some of the things that I'm talking about here. But we wanted to, we thought it was a good time to step in and do some improvements to this, or catch people up on what we've been working on. So one of the changes that we see is, if you look at the structure of this now, right, you can see that it is named short name of the KEP, in also including the KEP issue number, right? So this is kind of a great way to see immediately what issue, what enhancement issue this KEP is connected to, right? You'll also see that they're in a directory now, right? So it's a directory named what was originally the KEP title, and we're breaking out into two separate files. One is the README, which is actually the KEP content, right? And the second one is KEP.yaml. And the KEP.yaml is what was originally the front matter for the KEPs, right? So we can see the KEP number has come back as 617, and now we're binding KEP numbers to the issue, the enhancement issues. So there is, the original concern around that was essentially having collisions on the numbers. And for people who worked in the earlier release cycles around enhancements, we saw that there were quite a few collisions while people were working on KEPs. So we think that this will prevent some of that. This also gives us a means to easily scrape the KEP.yamls and use that information to build a website that's very similar to, that will be very similar to the rel notes website. So what else did we add, right? So here, we want to add a notation that allows people to see that certain things are not resolved, right? And we might bike shed on what this notation looks like a little bit, but right now it's kind of like unresolved, two less than signs, square brackets, and unresolved, right? And the reason for this is if we wanted it to be visible on the document and not get eaten by any comment formatting from HTML or Markdown, right? So we had to choose some arbitrary thing. There has to be a better way to do this, which we will think about a little later. But changing the names of the KEPs, as I mentioned, right? Directory structure that we were just talking about. having the metadata split out. We removed some of the fields from the metadata. We realized that editor is not really used. Last updated can be tied to Git history, so it's kind of easy to present this field just based on the last time that the document was updated. And then the superseded field was also removed, right? So the idea being that if you have a new KEP that supersedes a previous KEP, you would just link it in the replaces field for the new KEP, right? Because it's more likely that people are issuing updates to a newer KEP than adding implementation history and superseded by within the old one, right? So additionally, we want to make it very clear that one enhancement is equal to one KEP, right? The enhancement issue and the KEP track the evolution of a KEP from from baby stages, provisional, alpha phase into its GA, right? So there's not a requirement for you to open a new KEP for every phase of an enhancement. It is a requirement that you update the KEP, the existing KEP, as you move through those phases and you work through the release team checklist and so on, and make sure all of that stuff is up to date. Run through the implementation history, add some things, add some docs where needed. So also the adjusting some of the tooling, a lot of the stuff we've done. So we've done the add kind KEP to community and K features, which are now K enhancements. You can see this KEP is showing its age with these links. But so those labels are implemented, and we're going to I think they've now been removed from K community since we've done that sweep. But we also we've done this move into K enhancements. I think what we're just going to do is deprecate the architecture documents, or deprecate the design proposals rather in K community, so that you'll see that come soon. There'll be a blockade added to K community to prevent people from issuing new design proposals to that. I think that we've kind of closed out the existing design proposals already and pointed people towards KEPs, but this will just be a final enforcement mechanism to make sure that people can't commit there anymore. And then and then working on making sure that people understand this new directory structure, and probably adding some tooling around helping conversions between the old and the new. So that's that. That was a lot of stuff. Does anyone have questions? Awesome. Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. The next one is Rapture, right? So Rapture is a tool that is used internally at Google to essentially rapture packages from one place into the place that they belong, and that are the official apt and yum repos for Google, which are the ones that we use for the release process to publish our debs and RPMs. So I think it's important that we understand how a little bit more about how that works as we're starting to change the way that we produce these artifacts, right? We want to make sure that we're building a system that understands the inputs and outputs of Rapture, so that we can build tools like PKG around that, right? Googlers, the build admins, or the set of Googlers that have access to publish to the package repository, they essentially use an older version of our repo to publish, to use the scripts and tools to output debs and RPMs to then publish to their official apt and yum repos. So we don't want that, right? We want them to be using the up-to-date scripts, which means that the up-to-date scripts need to be in parity with the older ones. So we have a little work to do there. The reason why this is so important is we have there are a lot of things that get blocked as a result of debs and RPMs, right? So one is just the fact that we as a community don't have access to do this arbitrarily, right? This is a, we work on the release cycle, so release day, or whether it's a patch release day or a minor release day, it's making sure that we stay in contact with the Googlers to schedule times to do this, right? So they have to be on deck once we say that the release is published to GitHub to pick up those, to use those artifacts to generate the debs and RPMs, right? So we want to move towards a place where the community has full ownership of these artifacts, the generation and publication of these artifacts. But for that to happen, there are lots of things in the middle of that. So Sasha, I think you're on the call. We were talking about what does it look like for us to do our own apt and yum repos? Where do we put those? What are the permissions behind that? Who is managing those details? GPG keys, how do we sign these things? How do we make sure that they're published in the correct way? How do we make sure that the people, only the people that are supposed to have access to that GPG key to do signing? And how do we do all of that in a safe way, right? So lots of questions to answer. And so far, this has been kind of back burner in comparison to, in comparison to some of the other stuff that we've worked on in migration to Kubernetes infra. So if you want to take a look at some of the work that's been done around this, here's an issue, release 9.11. If someone wants to put that into the doc, and George, I'm going to answer your question in a bit. So yeah, so build is a little less important. Build will be more so easier to solve once we move over to Kubernetes infra on the PROW side, right? Because we want to make sure that where we're publishing, I would love us to get to a point where we can publish artifacts for nightly builds, right? Or have this process run end to end, once a day, twice a day, right? To get us to the point where people can consume Kubernetes kind of closer to the time that it's being, the time that it's being released, or on a pre-release level, right? So build is less important today. I think the ones that really get us are the staging and release process, right? So a few things have happened on the staging side, and if you saw, there's a feature branch called prototype that I've been trying to, search and replace variables and undo certain things in Anago and the release libraries to make it function for different GCP projects, different GCS locations, different GCR container registries. Some of that work, so a lot of it is creating, making sure that we have the correct IAM privileges attached to certain people, ensuring that we have KMS access for our GCP projects, and making sure KMS is even enabled, right? So we can store keys like the GitHub token and pull those out and put them where they need to be so that we can publish releases, or sign Git commits, things like that, right? So a big part of this was creating the new projects themselves and updating the scripts on the Kates.io repo to enable us to kind of, we have the staging project set up right now, staging and kind of test prod, but because release kind of has a subdivision in this hierarchy of people who need to control certain things and assets that are sensitive, we have a bit more work to do there. So I think most of that work is done right now. So the next phase that we're looking at is phase 2, which is the VDF, the kates.gcr.io cutover. So you might have seen emails from Linus and myself over the past few weeks, just talking about when this thing is going to happen. If you want to check out this issue, it's something that we've had open since 2017. So it's kind of exciting to see that this is finally going down. But part of that is Part of that is one, making the changes on the Google side. So kates.gcr.io is a vanity domain that points to the Google Containers project, which is where we um, store all of the containers that we use for the release. So the first class images, things like the API server controller manager, scheduler, proxy, so on and so forth, but also kind of these base images, things like kubectl and Debian base and Debian hypercube base, and literally anything that is behind that kates.gcr.io vanity domain. We need to make sure that we backfill that into Kate's Artifact Prod, which is a new project for everything that is being promoted up from staging, right? So this week we hope to hear some more about what the progress is on the Google side, so we can push forward. Because in coordination it requires a change on the release engineering side to turn that on for Anago and our release libraries, right? So expect more of that work within the next few weeks. Stuff to happen within changes to Anago, announcements, but also a big change for the release managers here will be the fact that we are no longer have access to push directly to staging and prod right now. We'll continue to have access to push to staging, but we'll need to use the new image promotion process to move containers from container images from Kate's infra staging into the new Kate's artifact prod, which will be the backing location for the new kates.gcr.io. Right? So any questions on that stuff? Okay. All right. So next one up is the Create CI Signal project. I was prepping for some presentations today, so I didn't get to do that yesterday. But essentially, we have an issue up, and I'll comment today. I have an issue up for someone opened it. I forgot who it was. It was me. I think it was me. Yeah. But we've had lots of discourse in that issue around creating a CI Signal subproject, right? It's clearer and clearer as we move through these cycles that we need a team that is not just focused on the quarterly work around CI Signal. So the 119 branch as well as the master blocking and forming tests, but also the entirety of CI Signal health for Kubernetes, right? So making sure that we have feedback loops between us and the teams that are responsible for those tests, making sure that we are vicious, I guess is a nice word, around the criteria that we hold for promoting, bringing tests into informing and promoting them to blocking, right? Making sure that these are actually tests that we, that we care about, right? That we care about, they have value to the community at large, and that are things that can and should block a release, right? So we've got some great documentation there already, but buffing that up even further, and having a team that can be responsible for creating these connections and collaborations between multiple SIGs around testing, right? So there are some things that have to be hashed out on that issue around scope. And really, when I opened it, it was meant to be, it was kind of a brain dump. I said, these are the things in my head. These are all potential things that CI Signal could do. Here you go, right? And I think we need to walk back some of that, give really tightly scope them to say, hey, we've identified people across the cycles who have been helping out with this, and at this point, we need to turn them loose, give them this list as a loose list of hey, these are potentially things that could be in scope, right? And then have that team of people who have already been working on this determine what's in and out of scope. because there is some, there are some tight overlaps between that project's creation and the charter for SIG testing. So we want to spin that up, but we want to make sure that we're also not stepping on toes in their charter. So I'll work on that today, Jorge, and hopefully we can just run with this for 119. Any questions?
Sounds good.
Cool.
I feel called out with thank you.
Yeah, no. I mean, I appreciate. This is I would say this is like 20% of some of the stuff I'm looking at. So, constant reminders. Like if I drop something, let me know, so I can pick it back up.
And just kidding, by the way, on the called out. But hey, again, thank you so much for all the work and all the eyes.
For sure. So you asked a question in chat, random question, is SIG-PM still a thing, right? So that leads us to our next one, which is not so much release related, but it's kind of release related, right? Because this is the front section of our release cycle, right? So we're going to be talking with, or I have been talking with SIG architecture, as well as some of the enhancements leads on a enhancement subproject, right? So the enhancement subproject currently lives in SIG-PM, right? It was migrated out of SIG architecture and into SIG-PM around the time that we were also doing some of these KEP modifications, right? It was pretty clear at that time that ownership should be under SIG-PM, right? And across the, I guess it's been a few years now, right? So across those years, I've kind of seen that we don't necessarily have the viewership, subscribership, contributors in place in SIG-PM to continue SIG-PM. So some of you might be hearing here first, and you'll see later in the week some emails go out for me about retiring SIG-PM. So the idea is that those emails would land kind of in tandem, one to discuss the retirement of SIG-PM, and another one on the architecture mailing list to migrate the enhancements project back to SIG architecture, right? So from there, what I'd like to do is take the set of enhancements leads who have been working on enhancements for the past few cycles, maybe 4 or so cycles, and bring them in as sub-project owners for the enhancement sub-project, right? They're people who are kind of close to the metal and working in enhancements, understanding what does and doesn't work. And we had some great conversations about that in the retro. So lots of stuff to write up, lots of stuff to think about. Lots of people on the SIG architecture side who have started to think about enhancements more deeply as their reviewers and approvers for enhancements. So I think it's a good time to merge those streams and have those teams collaborate more effectively together. So that's not a random question at all. It's a good question, and that's something that will be happening soon. So any questions on that? Okay, so that's I would say that that's super secret information, but yeah, it's on a recorded call now, so it's coming soon. So the next one up is talking about removing fast forwards, right? So this is going to affect the release process in ways that maybe have not calculated yet, because this is also around tooling changes. But the general idea is that, one, how do we get, do we need to do fast forwards at all, right? And two, how do we get people to work on, how do we get people to operate as expected for the various boundaries that we have throughout the release cycle? So if you think of code freeze and code code thaw and enhancements freeze and all these things, like it kind of rolls into the way that the next portion of the cycle will function, right? So in my head, what I see happening is more releases for the cycle, and well, maybe one or two more, right? So I want to decrease the amount of alphas, right? So we have one alpha when we do the beta branch cut. So we have the alpha 0 comes out on the master branch when we do the beta 0 cut. So the alpha 0 of the next release, right? So when we cut the 118 beta 0 branch, we also cut we cut the branch for that, but we also cut the tag for 118 alpha 118 beta 0. But simultaneously, we also cut the 119 alpha 0 tag on the master branch, right? So the idea would be to shift the branch cut a little further out in the cycle, do more betas, right? So if if you've been an operator or a service provider for some time, you know that there is a tendency for people not to be too excited about picking up a .0 or picking up an alpha of anything, right? Regardless of the team that's behind it and the amount of work that goes into it. It's early days and they don't necessarily want to be the first person to jump out and try those things out, right? So we want to try to build a little bit more confidence in this, and maybe this is a perception thing, but I think by doing more betas, people will go, oh, it's getting ready. and I think we'll see a little bit more rigorous testing as a result of that. So additionally, I'd like to add at least one more RC towards the end of the cycle. And I think that the RC is a good time to cut the branch, right? And then we can start to impose restriction, because it's on a branch, we can start to impose restrictions there. We can say that maybe the RC happens at code freeze, right? And what we're allowing to happen there as well is that we push people earlier into, so we have a cherry pick deadline that is very close to the end of the cycle. What's cool here is with more RCs and doing the branch cut when we hit the RC stage, we start pushing people into the cherry pick process earlier, right? So the new restriction would become, if you want to get your thing in, it has to be cherry picked, right? And the cherry pick has an additional level of rigor there, right? And it's also for cherry pick to be approved, it has to be reviewed by some release manager, right? So I think that that's an additional gate. It may seem like a hurdle for contributors, but I think it's an additional gate that allows us to be a bit more diligent about what we let into the release, right? If a branch manager is reviewing it, so the ownership of that branch stays on the branch manager until the .0 comes out, right? So the branch manager would work with the patch release team to review some of the stuff and go, okay, well, is this something that, the biggest question you want to try to answer with a patch is this something that's going to detrimentally affect this release, right? Is it something that introduces new functionality that maybe shouldn't, right? One of the key questions that we ask on the patch release team is this a feature, right? We should not be introducing new features to a release branch unless there is kind of a vague it's a fuzzy line between whether it's a feature and a bug, right? Sometimes you enable new functionality, say this comes up very often on the cloud provider side, right? Where you enable new functionality on the cloud provider, which effectively nullifies a bug, right? And those are situations that we look at and go, okay, maybe, but convince me, right? So I figuring out exactly how to do this, because like Anago is wired today to automatically if you're doing a beta 0, it'll turn that beta 0 into 2 releases, right? So that beta 0 and then the alpha 0 on the master branch, right? Now, what's cool about also doing the RCs is that the alpha that we cut now become the new alpha, or the alpha next, right, that we cut for the master branch is now a lot closer in line in feature set to what the RC is for the 118 or 119, right? So one of the problems that we've had before is, we release the alpha 0, and people who need to consume alpha 0 start doing so, but alpha 0 still looks a lot like what beta, what 118 beta 0 was, for example, right? So by shifting that over, we get a little closer to having the V1 next look closer, the V1 next alpha 0 look closer to what the RCs look like, right, for the previous cycle. So I think it's the net effect will be good. But there's stuff that we'll have to work out in our tooling to make sure it actually works that way. And I think that moving to that cadence will put us closer to having the RC on that code freeze line, right? So not only will we be able to enforce some of the things that are happening, or some of the things that we expect for code freeze within the updates to the way that PROW handles certain labels, but we'll also be able to enforce that by having additional rigor with the branch managers looking at those PRs as well. Okay, thoughts?
Quick question. Do we have any feedback from people who actually use RCs and betas? Do they use them because they are tagged as RCs and betas, or do they use them because they are pre-releases that are cut around certain deadlines of the cycle, of the release cycle?
You know what? It's I don't have a good answer for you. We did a survey, I would say it's about a year ago at this point, to see who was consuming what, and I think we more so focused on minor and patch versions in that survey. I did a poll on Twitter, super official, about who was consuming what, right? So like my friend Dalton, he works on the distribution for, he works on Typhoon, which is an open source distribution for Kubernetes, right? And he consumes everything, right? But you've got other people who did not know it existed, right? So I'd say maybe 200 people responded to that survey, and 50% of them, about 50% of them, didn't know pre-releases existed, right? So I think that this is a mechanical thing that we can help solve, as well as a communications thing that we can be better about, right? But we need to make it easier for people to consume before expecting them to do so. Cool. All right. So any questions on that before I move? All right, so I'm going to jump around a little bit. One of the things that we're talking about right now, I sent an email out to Contribx and the community talking about issue triage workflow and automation improvements. So we're trying to start small here, and you can see there's a bunch of conversation on this KEP already. I have to respond to Tim on this one later today. But the basic idea here is that we want to make it easier, and this is something that will affect the release team too, because we're trying to make it easier for, no, don't edit, okay. Trying to make it easier for people to triage the issues that are open, right? So if you read this KEP, you'll see that they're on the order of 2,100 at, we can look at this, right? So total 2968 between issues and PRs open in Kubernetes at any one time, and it hovers right around that 3,000 range, right? And various ones are in various states of staleness, right? So stale, rotten, or frozen, and maybe stale as well, right? So that's about, it's about 20% if we aggregate those numbers, and 42% of issues that could potentially require uh, um, attention, right? So looking at the user stories, and again, I tried to make this cap pretty short so that we could merge quick and iterate, right? So the stories are, as a group lead, a SIG chair, technical lead, working group, user group organizer, subproject owner, I want to be able to easily triage my group's backlog of open issues and PRs to accelerate merge velocity and issue resolution, right? As a reviewer or approver, I want a simple system to categorize issues and PRs in my purview so I can prioritize what to review first. And as a contributor, I want to be able to submit issues or PRs, and this is, constant contributor or a drive-by contributor, right? I want to understand how the community works to address those new submissions. I want to have some assurance that they'll be routed to the correct group, and I want to have them addressed in a timely manner, right? And this all seems, I think it all seems reasonable. So phase 0 of this, right, is to create a needs triage label, right? So the needs triage label would operate much in the same way that the needs kind, needs priority, and needs SIG labels operate, where they are mutually exclusive with a corresponding kind, priority, or SIG label, right? So the idea is that we'd bring in 2 new labels, needs triage and triage ready. We're bike shedding the same, and I've said, somewhere that's, it should be considered a placeholder name, in this provisional state, depending on what we decide is a more appropriate name. And then the second, adding a restriction here. One of the things that we heard from when we shopped this with the SIG chairs and technical leads was that one, this is generally useful. Just having this label and being able to search on this will give you some signal about what to attack next. Especially if your SIG does triage planning or planning meetings. And then the second part is, the request from Tim was basically that a SIG should not be able to, so ideally only people from that SIG or people who are authorized to do triage are removing this label or applying this label, right? So my thought here is to, in the same way that we restrict the way people can apply a milestone, we'd use the milestone maintainers team to restrict who can apply the triage label. That doesn't get us the granularity of being able to do it by SIG, but to be able to do it by SIG, we need to, or any group, we need to be able to essentially splat those groups, right, and configure permissions. And I think that is messier than we need to messier route than we need to go down. So I think that milestone maintainers gets us most of the way in terms of that restriction. And then from there, SIG would go through whatever their triage workflow is, right? So, SIG cluster lifecycle has a grooming document about how they do what they do, right? So the second part of this would be removing unused triage labels, right? So currently we have triage duplicate, triage needs more information, triage not reproducible, support, and unresolved, right? Proposing that we remove the duplicate, the not reproducible, and the unresolved labels, right? These are labels that are commonly unused. And leaving the needs information label, the ready label, or whatever we decide to call that label, and the support label, right? So I think there was a response about keeping triage support, and I kind of agree with Tim's comment on the KEP. I think it would probably be more appropriate if we renamed this label to kind support, right? The idea for these is like, if you open a support question in Kubernetes, someone's supposed to come along and close that issue, right? The issue is essentially there, my understanding at least, the issue is there to provide people a venue to submit it, right? But then from there, we're supposed to point you to a more appropriate venue, whether that's Stack Overflow, Discourse, Slack, right? To get you support for that, right? We're supposed to be handling things like failing tests, flakes, regressions, bugs, features, right? Within Kubernetes, and not anything support related, right? That's not meant to be one of our support channels. Bob, I think you're here. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yep, your suggestion was actually exactly what I was thinking, and just
Yeah.
renaming triage support to area or kind or something like that. Just something that we can signal that it honestly should be closed or shuffled someplace else.
Cool, cool. So updates to this kept coming today, later today. And we hope to, I've set a lazy consensus date for merge for this Thursday, barring any more blocking comments. I think once I do this update, we should be good to go. Tim's suggestion on the triage ready was to be triage accepted by SIG. And honestly, I don't care. Like if it works for people, like we can name it, whatever whatever people want. Just that we have a label that functions in that way is what I care about, right? And I think that a lot of the SIG chairs and leads express that just having the SIG having the needs triage label solves a lot of their problems, right? So I think that this is a net improvement. And this is also one of those weird things where there's certain things that we try to tackle for the cycle that can kind of only be successful if we do it at the beginning of the cycle. So this one has kind of, we've kicked the can down the road a few times on this one. I think it's time. I think it's time we do it. People are hurting. Lots of email threads back and forth about how, they've got a ton of issues and not a really easy system to work through them. So this would be a start. Afterwards, we want to talk a little bit more about entry and exit criteria for issues and PRs within Kubernetes, right? So you imagine something gets opened and it will automatically get tagged with needs triage, right? A SIG comes by, like if it is tagged for a SIG, then great. The SIG sorts by their issues as well as needs triage, and then they're able to see a list of things that they haven't looked at yet, right? From there, they apply whatever triage magic they have and move it into the state of ready or accepted by SIG or whatever we end up calling it. And from that, there we can see that like, hey, this issue is ready to be worked on, right? And maybe at that point it's also assigned, maybe it has a priority, maybe it has a good first issue label attached or a help wanted label attached. So we talked about a few different ways to do this. Maybe we use the help wanted label and automatically apply that. That seemed, that seemed not necessarily helpful if it wasn't properly triaged at the same time. So I think that this is a reasonable path forward, at which point we can talk about, okay, well, what does the waiting room look like? Do we have a needs info label where, it essentially means waiting for user or blocked on user or something like that? And we can sort by those too, to determine if something's ready to work. So maybe you triage 2 streams or, so lots of stuff to discuss. And I think lots of opportunity to bike shed there. So this was kept intentionally short to kind of close the areas for where potential bike sheds could open up. So we're going to try to merge this quickly, decide what needs to happen to move this to implementable, and start knocking out some of that work for 119. There are already carry PRs opened in test infra. It's linked in the implementation history, where you can see the work of actually adding needs triage, and this will be renamed to triage, and creating those labels, and then making sure that they we need to do some stuff. Okay, yeah, this is the prow configuration, right? So needs triage and what org and repo it's operating over and the regex that it applies to and yada yada yada. So I need to clean this up now that we've had some updates to the KEP, but the PRs are pretty much ready to go for this. So we just, the bigger part is because this is a change that will affect the entire community, we need to drive community consensus around it, right? So know that that's coming for 119. This will affect the way that the bug triage team works. And in general, every team, I think teams that are looking at, like teams like CI Signal, who are looking at, newly open failing tests and flakes and regressions, and then also teams like bug triage, who are looking at newly created issues that are in milestone or need to be moved out, and what have you. I think it'll be a net improvement for the bug triage experience, because this is kind of a trickle down effect, right? Where if the SIGs can triage their stuff more effectively, that means less of the triage work is going to be on the bug triage team, which and again, I think I've said this previous cycles. I don't think that work should be on bug triage. I don't think a team of 4 people should be responsible for ensuring that the states are correct for potentially hundreds of issues within Kubernetes. I think that pushing more of that work into the SIGs and sub projects is going to be a net win for the SIGs as well as the release team and the sub project owners and role leads on the SIG release side. So. Any comments?
Yay.
Yeah. I love it. Okay, so we've got a minute to go. I know I've been yapping for an hour. But I thought it was important to get us all on the same page around some of the things that we should care about for 119. So if there are any parting comments, concerns, questions. All right. Well, that said, well, you all have a happy Tuesday, and thank you for hanging out with SIG Release. Later.
Thank you.
Take care, all.
Happy Tuesday, everyone.